The public discourse is saturated with the kinetic threat of hypersonic missiles. This is a deliberate misdirection. The first strike in a 21st century conflict will not be an explosion. It will be silence. As the United States deploys its financial architecture as an overt weapon, shutting off a nation's oil valve, as seen with Havana, and weaponizing Federal Reserve crisis tools, as Harvard economists now warn, it corners adversaries. They cannot respond symmetrically. Their only rational, asymmetric response is to sever the system's nervous system. CSIS analysis confirms the primary targets are not cities, but the undersea data cables and satellite constellations that underpin global finance and military command. This is the blueprint to create the blind Leviathan, a world power suddenly deaf and mute, its markets frozen. The true launch-on warning trigger is not an incoming missile. It is the systemic paralysis that makes kinetic escalation the only mathematical option. States do not initiate systemic conflict from a position of strength. They do so from a position of weakness. The motive is not ambition, it is survival. We are witnessing a series of national solvency crises, where the mathematical cost of compliance exceeds the kinetic cost of defiance. Consider the Russian Federation. A protracted conventional war is the ultimate domestic liability. CSIS analysis confirms that such a conflict drains the treasury, decimates political capital, and becomes an unsustainable economic bleed. It is an unpopular war precisely because it threatens national solvency. This weakness forces a pivot. A state that cannot win a symmetric war of attrition, a dollar-for-dollar, shell-for-shell engagement, is forced to seek asymmetry. It must abandon the expensive conventional battlefield and find new vectors of leverage. This isn't a choice. It is a mathematical imperative. Simultaneously, the United States deploys its own asymmetric weapon, the financial system. As a Harvard economist warns, Federal Reserve crisis tools can be weaponized. The petrodollar system's erosion forces this hand. Financial architecture is no longer a tool of global stability. It is an instrument of targeted liquidation. This corners the adversary. Reports from Havana describe a nation preparing for war as the U.S. shuts off Cuba's oil valve. This is the blueprint in miniature. While analysts note NATO is preparing for a potential war with Russia, the primary battlefield is already active. It is economic. The result is a launch-on warning posture. When a nation's solvency is under terminal attack, the calculus inverts. The long-term certainty of economic collapse becomes a greater threat than the short-term risk of kinetic escalation. Breaking the financial siege by any means necessary becomes the only rational strategic option. The kinetic cost curve has inverted. According to the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a $5 million main battle tank, a core asset of conventional land power, is now a liability against a $500 FPV drone. This is not a market correction. It is an economic singularity. This phenomenon is the democratization of violence, the decoupling of lethal force, projection, from industrial-scale state funding. When an adversary is cornered by financial sanctions facing a national solvency crisis, this asymmetric leverage becomes their only rational response. They cannot build a competing SWIFT system, but they can mass-produce kinetic assets with a 10,000 to 1 cost-to-kill ratio. The strategic calculus shifts from deterrence to a low-cost, kinetic launch on warning posture. The math is irrefutable. The blueprints for systemic conflict are not tested on the primary adversary. They are staged in proxy laboratories, designated gray zones, where financial weapons can be calibrated without triggering a full-spectrum response. These are not kinetic battlefields. They are financial stress tests designed to measure the breaking point of a nation-state. The protocol is documented. In Cuba, the United States shuts off the oil valve, a direct logistical and financial attack. The result, reported by CNN, is immediate. Havana prepares its people for war. This is a controlled experiment. The input is a financial blockade. The output is a calculated timeline to systemic collapse or kinetic retaliation. The tools for this new battle space are central bank protocols. As analysis from Harvard confirms, Federal Reserve crisis tools can be weaponized. Therefore, regional instability, flagged by RUSI in commodity corridors from Southern Africa to North America, is not viewed as a liability. It is a live fire range to test these asymmetric vectors. The data gathered from these proxy laboratories is critical. It calculates the precise pressure required to force an adversary toward a solvency crisis, mapping the point where their only rational response becomes kinetic. This is the final calibration before deploying these weapons against a peer competitor, an environment where, as Maslenikov notes, NATO is already preparing for a launch-on-warning conflict with Russia. The gray zone is where the kinetic cost of a dollar-based liquidity crisis is solved. The final solvency crisis for a nation-state is not financial. It is existential. To prevent this, nuclear powers operate on a protocol known as launch-on-warning. This is not a strategy of retaliation after an enemy strike has landed. It is a preemptive response triggered by the detection of an inbound launch. The logic is a zero-sum calculation of time and physics. Waiting for kinetic impact guarantees the destruction of command, control, and retaliatory capability. Therefore, the protocol dictates that a confirmed launch signal from an adversary must trigger an immediate, full-scale response. It is a mathematical trap with no escape. This protocol's primary liability is its absolute dependence on data integrity. The new vector of asymmetric warfare, as outlined in CSIS threat models, is not a physical first strike. It is a digital one. An adversary can achieve the same outcome by executing a sophisticated cyber attack that either blinds early warning radar or, more critically, injects false data, simulating a mass launch event. This creates the fog of digital war. The commander is now cornered by his own protocol. The system is screaming of an existential threat. The data, now a potential weapon, demands a launch. To hesitate is to risk total annihilation if the threat is real. To launch is to initiate global kinetic conflict if the threat is a ghost in the machine. This forced error scenario is the true systemic risk, transforming a digital breach into a mathematical accelerant for world war. The central banking tools designed for crisis management have now been fully weaponized. As the petrodollar system erodes, this financial architecture becomes the primary vector for projecting American power. This is an asymmetric advantage. Adversaries facing a solvency crisis engineered through sanctions, as documented in cases like Cuba, are cornered. Their financial systems cannot compete. When unable to retaliate through equivalent financial means, a state's only rational response is to escalate to a domain where it can compete, kinetically or systemically. Reports from analysts like Maslenikov indicate major powers like Russia are already on a pre-war footing with NATO. This is not a coincidence. It is a calculated response to economic containment. Before a full-spectrum conflict, a test is required, a calibration shot. Its purpose is to measure the West's response time and attribution capability under stress. The event must be catastrophic, but plausibly deniable. CSIS analysis confirms extreme vulnerability in subsea data infrastructure, the physical backbone of the financial system. The forecast for the next 12 months is therefore not a market crash, but a targeted, systemic blackout. A momentary but total disruption of the transatlantic Maria or AE Connect 1 subsea cables. The event will be attributed to a seismic event or freighter anchor drag. Its true purpose is to calculate the kinetic cost of the next phase,